Joining us now, though, is Tom Perriello. Tom, former congressman in the 5th District of Virginia, Democrat, got elected in 2008 with President Obama when he came in, was defeated by 3% in 2010, was a big backer of President Obama, stood firm with him. We have him on today because he is surging in the polls and giving the Virginia Democrat establishment all kinds of fits. We think this race right now is a dead heat, and we think he's got the momentum. And I don't really think his opponent's campaign really knows what to do with Tom Perriello. So that's why we're excited to have him on. He's surging right now. Tom, good to have you with us, man.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so just talk about your most recent experience where you were President Obama's special envoy to the African Great Lakes. Where did you live and what did you learn there, Tom?
Well, I was actually based in Alexandria working out of headquarters, but I spent about 2/3 of my time across Africa and Europe. And, you learn a lot of things from trying to bring people together around a peace deal. One is you realize you want to be negotiating from strength, and two, you realize that solutions usually don't come from the top down. They're usually out among the people, and they're being blocked by elites in most of the countries. But we were able to put together a great program working with our European allies. It still is important to work with European allies, to work with the Chinese to convince them why we might see a region similarly. The Vatican, in this case, was actually a very progressive force in the region, so there was an opportunity to work with them. So it was a microcosm of where we are, I think, in the world in terms of trying to put alliances together to make the world a safer place. But again, I think one of the things you figure out is how to bring people together, and one of the things you certainly learn over and over again is that it's a lot easier if you don't care who's getting the credit for it. And I think that's something that we can bring into politics as well, trying to bring folks together and trying to focus a little less on who wins and who loses and how we actually just move solutions forward.
All right, Tom Perriello, well, I have to say we lauded here on the John Fredericks Show your campaign announcement, and the way it was done was one of the best kept secrets ever. And I thought the way you guys handled that was stealth and politically one of the most dynamic things I've ever seen. Now, I want to get to Trump's travel ban. It's now been struck down. The second ban struck down by a judge in Hawaii, 9th District. No surprise there. Judge in Maryland. I know that you have said publicly you were opposed to this. Why constitutionally doesn't the president have the right to restrict or decide who comes into the United States?
Well, I'll leave it to the courts to say. I mean, they said the illogic of the government's contentions is palpable. He's gone out and said things, and I think he has a tradition of thinking he can just say things and back off of them. But when he and those around him have specifically referred to it as a religious test, that's something that's not okay in our Constitution. I think there are other reasons it's a bad idea. I've worked with refugee populations. They're one of the most vulnerable groups in the world. They go through one of the most extreme vetting processes in the world. And I think beating up on the vulnerable when they've been a huge asset here in our communities across the United States is the wrong approach. But from a constitutional perspective, creating that religious test using really his own words and the words of his own advisors is something that, judges from across the political spectrum have shot down. And I think that shows that the Constitution and the system is working right now.
So do you believe that, and I just want to take this another step, if the U.S. was at war or under threat of beyond what we are now, do you think any president, whether it be President Trump or President Clinton or President Obama, has the right to say who comes into the United States? Tom?
Of course, the president's had that right. This president has that right, but there are limits on those rights that are set by the Constitution, and one of them is the setting of a religious test. So creating a straw man of the idea that this somehow hamstrings the president entirely is not the point. If President Trump had, not made it a religious test, campaigned on it as a religious test, referred to it that way, and then designed it that way, it wouldn't be a problem. So I think even in wartime, yes, it's extremely important for us to be able to protect the core constitutional values that make us different than other places and better than other places.
Now, look, Republicans have already debated 2 times. They've got 4 more debates scheduled. Their 4-way primary also on June 13th. There's going to be very little crossover here. Why haven't the Democrats debated?
We will. We've already been talking about it. We're certainly eager to do so. We've done a number of joint appearances. Ralph's obviously been in the General Assembly until recently, and we wanted to respect that space. So I think we'll have a good, healthy number of debates, and I know we're very eager to get to that.
Okay, so you would expect, what, several, 3, maybe 4?
I think the conversation has been going on, I think probably half a dozen, something like that. We certainly want an opportunity to cover a lot of substance and do it together. So we tend to be a party that's very comfortable with open, critical debate. And I know the Republicans have been having some good ones on their side as well.
All right, now, Tom Perriello, you've been criticized by your opponent for the nomination of making certain policy reversals since you're in the House. So if it's okay, I would like to go through these and get your response. Let's start with when you were in the House, you thought and made the statement that self-deportation of immigrants here illegally was not a bad idea. Now you've taken an opposite view from that. What happened? What changed?
Well, the statement was actually talking about the idea that we should be going after the employers instead of the vulnerable, and that in a lot of communities, the people who were hiring people illegally and often treating them very poorly as well were often let off the hook, while it was easy to demonize those who were trying to work in the shadows. So part of that was also in the context of comprehensive immigration reform, which I've always strongly supported. So I think that in that case, it's been something I've been pretty consistent on, is that we do need to have comprehensive immigration reform, and that we shouldn't be focusing on, demonizing and beating up on the vulnerable, but rather on those who are exploiting them.
And Tom, also in a letter you had written to then Attorney General Eric Holder when you were in the House of Representatives in Virginia, you called the assault weapons ban an affront to the Founding Fathers. You also got the NRA backing in your race for re-election in 2010 against Robert Hurt. Now you're taking an opposite position on that. Can you walk us through the change?
Well, I still support the Second Amendment and an individual right to bear arms, and I believe that's not inconsistent with supporting common sense gun reform, including universal background checks and smart gun technology and other processes, looking at the high-capacity magazines and other things that are valuable for public safety, and I think don't infringe on someone's right to exercise, the Second Amendment. So I think that this is, you said common sense for the Commonwealth. I think this is a place where there's room for that. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes there can be, rhetoric from the left that isn't very respectful of responsible gun owners. And obviously I grew up in an area of the state where that's a pretty common thing to do, to own guns, and whether it's to protect your home or to hunt. But I do think the NRA has become a more extreme organization. I think it's an organization that has focused more on, frankly, answering to gun manufacturers than gun owners. And I think they've, taken extreme positions that ultimately probably will not be productive for their members. So I think this is just a place where we should come together and say, look, there is a Second Amendment right to bear arms. I still believe that. But that's not inconsistent with having some common sense reforms that help make us safer.
All right, we are with Tom Perriello. Tom is running for governor. He's a Democrat. There's 2 candidates in that race. That'll be decided in a June 13th primary to face off with whoever the Republican nominee is. Tom, a former congressman from Virginia, 5th District, also worked in the Obama administration. Tom, just for a matter of just asking the question, several of the Republican candidates have already turned their 10,000 signatures in. We noticed that neither Democratic gubernatorial candidate has. Probably, we asked the Hortham campaign, they said, look, we were in the General Assembly until a couple weeks ago. Where are you guys on getting your necessary signatures, Tom?
I know we've had an amazing presence across the state. It is a really good volunteer building opportunity. People love the chance to help out. The response we've had has been tremendous. I don't know what the number is, but I know we're on track for what we need, and continue to see folks across the state. As you know, it's not just the volume of signatures, but making sure you have them from every congressional district. And I think one of the things we're really committed to, both in this campaign and as governor, is making sure that we're representing and reaching out to the whole state. Obviously, I come from Central Virginia and represented Southside Virginia. We've been out in Southwestern Virginia as well, and we certainly don't want anyone to think this is going to be a campaign where we're running up numbers in the Crescent and leaving the rest of the state out. And I think from how we're doing the grassroots effort around the petitions, where we're showing up at events, even if it doesn't make sense in the traditional way during a primary, we want to be reaching every corner of the state and hearing from folks.
Tom, I know there's a lot of things that President Trump does that you're not happy with. You've made that clear, and I respect your opinion on that. If you were to become the governor of Virginia, and whoever is the Democratic nominee is, without a doubt, the favorite going in. If you're the governor of Virginia, are there certain policies that President Trump might have that you could get behind? Like, for instance, when he came to Newport News Shipbuilding the other day, he's got a $54 billion increase in military spending, in defense spending, ships, submarines. It's going to put a lot of people to work in Virginia. Are there things that the president might do that you as governor could actually be behind?
Well, look, I've always been a huge proponent of supporting infrastructure build. It's something we desperately need in Virginia and in other parts of the country, and I think there's room for that in the shipbuilding area as well. I think there are a couple problems with it. One is that Donald Trump hasn't seemed to be able to deliver on any of the claims that he makes. So I think everyone, including in the military, has been more than a little skeptical of whether this is ever going to actually materialize. And the second problem is if you do that but then massively slash, as he's proposed, the State Department budget, the development budget, those are an enormous number of jobs in Virginia as well and a huge component of our national security. As you know, I've spent time in Afghanistan and in Sudan and the Balkans and other conflict zones, and you will hear from all of our military folks that they don't want this to be done just by the military. They need diplomats out there and the development component out there to help have an integrated national security strategy. On the jobs front, about two-thirds of the jobs, or a significant percent of the jobs across Virginia from the federal government are civilian jobs. So from a jobs perspective, while one component could be a positive thing, if that's done in a way that's going to have massive negative repercussions for jobs in other ways, I think that's certainly a move in the wrong direction. There are a lot of things, a lot of programs done by the federal government, many of them not necessarily initiatives out of the White House, that will continue to move forward in positive ways. We have our Department of Agriculture that's always doing some important work in our rural communities, et cetera. So I think there'll be plenty of ways to continue to partner with the federal government. But I think that what we're seeing from President Trump, unfortunately, continues to be something that's highly problematic for the economy in Virginia.
Tom, let's get to transportation and roads. One gubernatorial candidate, a Republican, Senator from Virginia Beach, Frank Wagner, has proposed an increase to the gasoline tax in order to once and for all get the revenue we need to get these roads expanded in Virginia. He's talked about expanding 58 into an interstate and things like that. Are you in favor of an increase in the gasoline tax in order to get additional dollars for transportation, or are you in favor of tolls, or neither?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that we need the infrastructure, and if we learned anything from the tunnel experience down there, it's that trying to act like you're not doing a tax on the front end ends up costing people far more. I mean, that would have been, $2.3 billion on the front end, and ends up being $23 billion on the back end, and now we're having to buy off the debt because of the way that they negotiated that deal. And it may have sounded good on paper, but I don't think anyone who's been through there disagrees that it would have been better off to do some revenue source, whether that was a gas tax or anything else, in order to pay for that up front. It's having a massive negative effect, of course, on small business in Portsmouth. In addition to, what we've seen, particularly for lower income workers, the working poor, who are getting hit with the tolls going through there at $10 a day, when they're making $7.25 an hour, which I think we need to raise and start to reward work across Virginia. So I think whether we're talking about the problems up here or down there, it's extremely up here being Alexandria. We need to look at it. The toll roads that are going in up here, I think are the new ones at least are being negotiated better, learning from that experience.
Right.
But I think at the end of the day, having the political courage to raise the revenue up front makes sense. I think if we combine some of the infrastructure needs in the Crescent that are very road, rail, and bridge heavy with rural broadband needs in other parts of the state, maybe we can avoid some of the regional divides that have kept this from going through before.
All right, Tom, let's get to the $64,000 question. So the entire Democratic elected state establishment has lined up between Lieutenant Governor Ralph Northam. Almost every state senator that I've talked to, the majority of the people in the House, they're all behind Ralph Northam. So you look at the level of backing that Northam has from the establishment, including current Democratic Governor Terry McAuliffe, who I think is going to run for president in 2020. How do you take this on and win, honestly?
Well, I've joked with the governor and others about how much I appreciate that unity. I mean, it's a good time to be seen as someone who's anti-establishment and outside the party leadership structure. And given, my background as a former congressman and senior Obama official, that might not have been the easiest pitch to make to people who didn't know me. For those who know my track record, they know that I've always worked, from outside the system and taken on special interests and taken on big lobbyists in D.C. But having that kind of establishment unity, including some colorful statements from some colorful individuals, has certainly been helpful around the state. I think it's helped to ignite a lot of energy in our campaign. Right now, I think that the energy on the progressive side, as you can see, is outside the party structure in addition to the party structure. I think the party's actually quite strong right now. I think people feel very positively about Governor McAuliffe. But I think there's also an interest through the Indivisible kind of groups and the Women's March kind of groups and others that they really see a desire for change coming from outside of some of those structures. And I think we've certainly become where we've had an opportunity to reach people, a candidate people are excited about in that way. So, I think people now have an ability to go around the gatekeepers that used to control politics. We've certainly seen that on the conservative side, and the rise of the Tea Party and beyond, and to Trump himself.
Right.
And it's an exciting time. It's a dynamic time, and I think ultimately what people took away from last year, whether they were on the Bernie side or the Hillary side or anything else, was that voters want to make their own choice. And ultimately, I think there's a lot of respect for many of our elected Democratic officials, and people will take that into consideration, but they're going to look at the candidates and make a choice. And so far, that's a choice that's been working out well for us.
Tom, we only have a couple more minutes. We're with Tom Perriello, Democratic candidate for governor, Virginia. Tom, so policy-wise, what's your beef with Ralph, right? I mean, he's been there as lieutenant governor. He's done a good job. He's got all the establishment backing. McAuliffe likes him. What's your beef?
There's no beef. He's the nicest guy in the world. He's going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. I think sometimes in politics we, personalize these things an awful lot. I think that we need to be bold right now, looking economically at the situation of how we create growth from the middle class out and not from the top down. I think that does involve trying to create more space for small business, including decentralizing energy and food production in other areas to give smaller businesses a chance in an era of deep consolidation. I think automation is something that is around the corner and already here that's going to be disruptive to the economy. We haven't seen the median family income really budge in Virginia under Republican or Democratic administrations. A lot of that has to do with a paralyzed legislature in Richmond. And I think that's one of the things people say is they want someone from the outside who's going to be able to come in and shake things up a little bit, across the aisle in Richmond. So, to me, politics doesn't have to be nasty and personal. It can just be about putting your best vision out there. And so far, people are responding to that extremely well and to that kind of politics. And, hopefully we think that's a winning strategy.
Tom, give me one substantial policy difference between yourself and the lieutenant governor.
Well, we've come out in opposition to the two gas pipelines that we believe are a $6.7 billion boondoggle where we could create far more Virginia jobs focused on investing in efficiency and renewables. But beyond that, there are many, many policy positions we've taken, which the Northam campaign has then agreed to. We came out on criminal justice reform, and now they have, and on a $15 an hour minimum wage that we need to get to, and they have. We on debt-free community college, and they have. So it's good to see that there's actually a lot of unity on policy on the Democratic side. But I think right now what people are looking for is a campaign like we've put together that's focused both on resisting the politics of hate and division from Donald Trump and a positive vision of inclusive economic growth, and one that's focused very clearly on the working and middle class and how we're going to help create better social mobility along the kind of promise we've always had here in Virginia.
If Tom Perriello was Virginia governor, are you going to want to renegotiate the Dominion Power rate deal that Frank Wagner negotiated in 2015 and that Terry McAuliffe signed and is now saying that he would unravel it? How do you stand on that?
Yeah, I don't think that's a good deal for ratepayers. I think we're going to look at the whole picture together of where Dominion, does some things right, provide good services, relatively cheap, but they've been a disaster on clean energy. We've already basically been losing the solar energy jobs to North Carolina, and now we're at risk of losing the wind energy jobs to Maryland because Dominion and the legislature stand in the way of it. It's incredibly bad for the Virginia economy. There are more people working today in clean energy jobs than fossil fuel jobs, and that trend line is only growing. And the major barrier in Virginia is not that we don't have businesses ready to do it and workers ready to do it. It's that we have a partnership between the legislature and Dominion that prevents it from happening. And it's one of the greatest barriers to job creation right now across Virginia, and we're going to look at that in an across-the-board way, including on the rate side.
Tom, you've been extremely gracious. One final question. Why are you a better candidate for Democrats in November than the lieutenant governor?
Well, first of all, I think that's just what we got to prove to voters. But I think ultimately, particularly if Ed Gillespie is the nominee, and I know you all aren't asking me for my advice on that, but I think there's a real opportunity here to do two things. One, get the fullness of the Obama coalition excited. I've been able to turn out the base even in a tough year for Democrats in 2010. I think I come from a space that I've worked for 20 years on issues of basic fairness across the progressive coalition. But I've also shown that I can win over conservative voters and independents, which I was able to do in the 5th District and represent that part of the state. And I think there are ways, to be honest, in which, and I've heard this from Trump voters, that Ed Gillespie is kind of everything Trump voters hate about their own party. And I think where we can call that out because we're willing to also speak to a corrupt system that has largely just reinforced and helped the richest and multinational corporations at the expense of smaller business and the middle class, which is a message I was very clear on in criticizing both Republican and Democrat elites back when I was in Congress and in my advocacy work. I think there's a huge opportunity here for us to not just, again, turn out the base, but win independent voters and conservative voters. And the good thing about that is that puts us in a better position to govern. And ultimately, what I'm trying to do here is not get a new title, it's to make a difference. And I think to make a difference, we are going to have to be able to change some of the dynamics in the legislature. And I do think that there are people on both sides of the aisle there right now that really would like to get some breakthroughs on education and infrastructure, on criminal justice reform and addressing the opioid crisis and other issues that should be right at the forebrain. But too often we've developed this dance where the Republicans will get credit for passing ridiculous bills they know are going to get vetoed. The Democrats will get credit for doing the veto, and then everyone goes home without actually having solved the problems that Virginians expect them to solve.
Tom Perriello, we're out of time. I want to thank you for being with us today. I'll let you in on a secret. Republicans don't want to have to run against you in November. I think you've got the momentum in this race. I think you're going to be very tough on June 13th. More information, it's real easy. Go to tom4forvirginia.com for more information. Tom Perriello, candidate, Democrat for governor, June 13th, Democratic primary. That'll be decided, I think, right now. It's a toss-up, and he's got the momentum. Tom, thanks for being with us.